is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hey, good morning, everybody. This is Bob Brinson, and I believe we are in week 6 of the SUSE SCE CLP Academy. Can everybody hear me okay as well as see my screen? All right, cool beans. All right, folks. For those of you who are not aware, we had sent out a notification I guess a week or two ago that we were not going to have a Wednesday call, so we may have some extra folks on the call today that don't normally attend our Friday morning call. So if you happen to fall into that camp, glad that you could join us on this call. Anyway, so for this week, we were actually scheduled to start the 3125. I am going to go ahead and take a peek at just a couple things out of the 3124 that we did not cover that I just want to make sure that we get out of the way in order to make sure that we've got y'all covered as far as the review is concerned. And then we'll go ahead and jump right back into the 3125 and move on from there, if that's okay with everybody. So where I wanted to take a quick peek, and I'm going to try and make this as brief as possible, is taking a look at some of the elements of Section 9 from the 3124 that dealt with administration and monitoring. And the first thing that the book actually had talked about was NTP, Network Time Protocol. For those of you who are not aware, time is a really critical thing. For instance, if you are working in a Windows environment, if your time is off by 5 minutes, actually probably to be more specific, about 4.5 minutes, it will prohibit you from logging in to things such as Active Directory. You'll get WinLogon error messages. In the old Novell world, time had to be fairly precise, much tighter than what you even have with Windows. Where does that come in relative to Linux? Well, a number of things. First and foremost, if you are dealing with certificates, if your certificates are off by more than 4.5 minutes, they will be invalidated. So like if you try and hit a secure website, or let's say hypothetically you're doing public key authentication, things of that nature. Let's see, really quickly, Emerine, hi, no plan to switch from NTPD to Cron YD. I have not heard of that, Emerine. It's not to say that it won't happen, but as of today, that's what we got to work with, right? We're still working with NTP, okay? Now, NTP actually operates off of UDP port 123, so you need to make sure that if you are implementing firewall services, that certainly that port happens to be open. Now, in much the same way that, like with Microsoft with their software update server, you can have a single box go out and fetch all of the updates, and then from that box propagate those updates out to all of the systems in your network. The same thing can be looked at relative to NTP, just from time. We're not talking software updates, but just time. You can actually have one or multiple servers within your network that will go ahead and fetch time on behalf of the network. And then from that point, all of your devices internally will go ahead and fetch their time from those boxes. Okay. Now, to understand NTP, obviously you have to understand, how the hierarchy works. So, we always hear the term atomic clock. With NTP, you are going to have these higher level NTP servers fetching their time from other sources like the atomic clock or things of that nature. But there are 16 layers of what we call stratum servers out there on the internet. Each stratum server is a layer removed from the atomic clock. So for instance, stratum 1 will get their time from the atomic clock, stratum 2 from stratum 1, stratum 3 from stratum 2, so on and so forth. Now the deal here is because of this hierarchical structure and the understanding that time will have minor deviations, time still will be fairly accurate. Okay, the daemon that's going to be used relative to NTP is called NTPD. Now, different Linux distributions will refer to this daemon differently. Some will just refer to it strictly as NTP. Other distributions, like SUSE, will refer to it as NTPD. As you might imagine, there is a configuration file for NTP. It's in the etc directory, etc ntp.conf. And inside this file, you can configure, for instance, using directives like server, you can actually refer to who it is you're going to be getting your time from. Conversely, as I had mentioned before, you can actually take that server and then turn around and advertise time to other boxes or supply time to other boxes. And you do that through the fudge directive. So with fudge, you're going to declare the IP network that you are going to be providing time for, kind of like a minor access control list, and then what stratum you're going to be advertising. Now, the key about stratum is if you are a client, and let's say you are operating at stratum 5, you are going to ignore any other stratums of a higher level than what you are. So, for instance, again, if you were operating at a stratum 5, you're only going to care about receiving time from a stratum 1 through stratum 4. You would totally ignore a stratum 10. So again, you can, within this file, you can do other things such as require authentication through key pairs. You can select what specific clients you are going to restrict time to. You can decide whether or not you want to broadcast that time out on the open network. Sounds great to do that, but I don't know about you. I'm always looking for ways to reduce the amount of traffic on my network, specifically broadcast traffic. Okay, so how do we deal with time? Well, when the server first boots up, or any device boots up, the first thing it's going to do is it's going to get its time from the BIOS. Now, when the BIOS, or actually when the kernel launches into memory, kernel is going to get its time from the BIOS, and then depending upon how you have the box configured, i.e. with NTP, then you will turn that management over to that particular service. And then while the daemon is running, it is periodically going to be going through and making very subtle adjustments to time. I mean, we're talking like, I think it's like 128 milliseconds or something of that nature. So you're going to make these little minor adjustments in order to try and shrink the delta between the time from the time source to the local time. All right. Now, if your time is off by more than 17 minutes, it's going to throw the daemon into what's known as insane time, which essentially the daemon's just going to shut down. It's going to throw its hands up and say, yeah, man, there's no way I'm going to be able to get in sync here. Okay. So if that's going to be the case, if your time is significantly off, how do you try and shrink that delta really quick? Well, the way that you're going to do that is, first things first, you're going to want to go ahead and shut the daemon down. So you can actually say rcntp stop. Then from there, using a command called netdate, and there's actually been some other commands similar to this, like ntpdate. But with netdate, you can actually provide who you want to fetch time from. So let's say, hypothetically, let's see, tick1 dot, actually, no, let's do this. Let's do time, no, ntp0 dot cornell dot edu. Now, I can't remember if this box has internet access, so we'll have to wait and see if this works. Could not find netdate. Well, that's interesting, because that's the command. Okay. I have to figure out what's going on with my box here. It should have net date. All right, well, let's see. Hi, Bob. Are you sharing your screen? Yes, I'm sharing my screen. Can everyone else see my screen just for grins and giggles? Okay. All right, so basically, the net date, the way it should be operating, is it should go out and fetch time on a one-time use basis. Then once you got the time collected on your box, then what you're going to do is execute a command hwclock --sys to hc. Now what this command will actually do is take the time that's currently running in the kernel by virtue of NTP and then write that to the BIOS. Why do we want to do that? Because clearly if the system reboots, we don't want the time to be significantly off. And then from there, obviously, you're going to run the rcntpd start. So rcntpd start. Okay. And then that will get the daemon back up and running. Now, there are some files besides ntpd or ntp.conf. One is called the drift file. It's going to be in varlib ntp drift ntp.drift. And the purpose of that file, that what it's going to do, is essentially go ahead and write these delta changes that are occurring by virtue of NTP. So that way, the next time that the kernel comes up, it's going to first fetch its time from the BIOS, then it's going to turn around and read this drift file to say, okay, based upon the last time I was up and running, this was what I needed to do to adjust the time to get as closely as possible, okay? And then at that point, hopefully that time is a little bit closer, okay? I just want to try one thing here. I think I had mentioned that there are other commands besides netdate. So I just want to try this one really quick. Cornell.edu. All right, so that one is actually working for me. Why netdate isn't, I'm not quite sure. This is going to fail, folks, just because of the fact that this box does not have the internet access. So just kind of keep that in mind, okay? Now, when I have failures and I know the reason why, that makes me feel a little bit better, okay? A couple commands that you can use to check your time status: ntp trace, as well as ntpq space -p. Okay, now beyond just doing this at the command line, as you might imagine, there is a YAST module under services called NTP configuration. This also just gives you a handy dandy little interface whereby you can go through and configure your NTP service, okay? Simply by clicking add, specifying server. When you click select, you can actually source public NTP servers based upon the country of origin and within that country what you have available. This is actually a fairly nice feature because it used to be you had to actually do like a Google search to find the public NTP servers and then provide that information directly. Now within the interface, it's providing you with known NTP servers. And before you save all of your details, you probably want to click test just to make sure that you are properly communicating with that NTP source before moving on. Okay. All right. Let's see. What's the difference between Cronny and NTP? Just different services, Sanjay. If you've heard me say this once, you've heard me say 100 times. The wonderful thing about Linux and open source is it's all about choice. So everyone and their brother is always coming up with new services, new daemons, new ways of doing things. And at certain times, people will make a switch from, one service to another for a variety of reasons. All right. The other thing I wanted to talk about really quickly is our syslog. Now, syslog services have gone through an evolution within a relatively short period of time. Up through SLES 11, we used to use a service known as simply syslog. I used to actually really like syslog. It was a very easy daemon to configure. Simply a single file, and in that file you would list the service dot whatever the priority level was, aka logging level, and where you wanted that data to go to. Okay. Now, services in terms of syslog are referred to as facilities. So anytime you hear the term facility, we're just simply talking about the service that we want to monitor. The priority is the logging level that we want to place this box in, from debug 2, which gives you everything under the sun, all the way up to emerge. Okay. Now in syslog, the original syslog, whatever logging level that you selected, it would operate with that logging level and everything above it. Okay. Then in SLES 11, they came out with this new syslog service called syslog NG, NG standing for next generation. So that's when I would usually play the Star Trek theme. And with syslog NG, it tried to make things a little bit more modular in its architecture. So within the configuration file for syslog NG, you would identify the source, meaning where you were looking to get your syslog information from, or more specifically, who you were willing to receive it from. Now, that may sound a little bit odd, but with syslog, you can actually receive logging information from other devices. So you could, in fact, set up a centralized syslog server to basically record all logging details from all of your network infrastructure devices. Now, that being said, if you're going to do that, I would highly recommend getting your hands on a competent syslog viewer that allows you to kind of filter out that information. Because even on a local box, sometimes it can be overwhelming with the amount of data that you're going to be looking at. Okay, so you would define the source, then you would create what were called filters, whereby you would establish the daemon or facility you were looking to monitor along with the priority level, the logging level. Okay, then you would define your destinations. In other words, where you were going to make available for information to be sent to. And then through a log directive, you would tie all of this stuff together. Who was the source? What was the filter, aka the facility and priority, and where you wanted the information to go. Now, with our syslog, it kind of combines the elements of both regular syslog and syslog NG. Now, there is a configuration file for our syslog. Oh, goodness gracious, it helps to put the full path. So it's in the Etsy directory, rsyslog.conf, and inside here, as I scroll through the, some of the minutia, here we're actually taking a slightly different approach in that we're actually kind of like building scripts with conditionals, okay? So you can see I've got an if-then conditional here, and then for these operations, I'm defining the parameters for those operations within parentheses, okay? So with this if statement, this is kind of sort of like building the filters from syslog NG. So I've got the syslog facility text equals kern. So I'm going to monitor the kernel with severity levels less than or equal to 4, which would be warnings, okay? And then based upon that, I'm also searching for statements that have in and out contained within them. for this particular operation. Well, where do we typically think of when we think of ins and outs, but packets, right? So if you look above, this is actually doing some monitoring as it relates to firewalls, okay? So we're basically monitoring any kernel messages of a warning level or higher, or actually lower, where there are statements for in and out, or if we're looking for other errors dealing with authpriv, and then based upon that, once I collect that data, I'm going to send it out to dev TTY10, which is yet another console. So that's an example where we're taking like these if-then conditional statements and leveraging the capability of the original syslog-ng. Now, if I scroll down a little bit further in this file, this is a representation of how we used to do the original syslog, whereby you would identify the facility, aka the service, dot, followed by the logging level, and then simply where you wanted it to go. This is how the original syslog used to work, okay? But as you can see with our syslog, we have a lot more power even above syslog-ng, in which I'm building these if-then conditional statements, and within the data that I'm receiving, I can actually get even more granular and filter out that data for precise information, okay? All right. Couple other things that they talk about with our syslog. You have the ability of extending the capability for security by including TLS. You can log information to other places other than text files or consoles, meaning I can actually send that data to backend database servers, etc. Okay. All right. There are some template files that the book noted that you can also take advantage of in order to make life easier. Okay. Now, log files themselves. One of the more common log files that you have at your disposal is varlog messages. This is like the general use log file. However, it is important to note that anytime you install a service, there is a high probability that it will maintain its own log file. Now, when you install the service, it will go ahead usually and incorporate its information, its logging information, into the applicable files so that that information is tracked in their own autonomous files. Some examples that were listed in the book were like cups for printing, YAST to monitor stuff that's occurring within YAST, mail for mail services, things of that nature. Now, one thing to think about, if you look at the logs, you can see all it is basically standard ASCII text. And if we did nothing, absolutely nothing, these log files would continue to grow and grow and grow. And depending upon how you've got your disk partitioned, if you did not put either var in general or var log more specifically on its own partition, you could at some point in the future run the risk of your root file system filling up. So when we start talking in more detail about how we partition our disks and why, it's always critical to make sure that your root file system, the root partition to be specific, does not fill up. It's kind of like if the C drive on a Windows box fills up, your server is going down. So how do we maintain our logs? Well, we do that through a service known as logrotate. Again, as you might imagine, there is a conf file for logrotate. It's called logrotate.conf. Okay. Inside this file, you're going to, or the system will set up the parameters by which we can archive our current log files, and eventually, as the age reaches its threshold, simply discard the older log files. Okay. Now, before people start freaking out, let's kind of talk about this for a minute. So within the logrotate.conf, we have a directory or directive for the frequency in which we are going to rotate out our log files, things like daily, weekly, monthly, that type of thing. And then based upon the rotation interval, we can also, through the rotate directive, flag how many backed up copies of archive log files do we want to maintain. So in this particular example, we are going to rotate our log files out weekly, but based upon that rotation schedule, we're going to keep 4 archived copies. Okay, so in other words, we're going to have a month's worth of data always maintained on the server. Now, that usually throws up flags for people because they're going to sit back and say, well, what if I'm trying to monitor something over time, let's say over 6 months? What am I going to do if I'm only keeping a month's worth of log files? Well, hopefully you're backing up your system, and included in that backup is backing up the archive log files so that if you ever had to, you can always go back and restore one of those backup copies in order to be able to continue to troubleshoot the problem. Sanjay, hold off on journal CTL. I believe we cover that in 3125, okay? The directive create. So when I archive off my log file, create literally creates a new one. It's like executing the touch command. Now for the archived file, what kind of extension do I want to give? So you can see we're going to take advantage of the datext extension. So literally the log file will be the log file name dot whatever the date happens to be. That way we know the details as far as when this particular archive was created. Now, by default, log files are not compressed, but I can easily do that by removing the comment here with the directive compress. But then I also must select what compression algorithm I want to use. Now, at the bottom of this file, you can see I have an include statement. What include statements do is they allow me to bring in configuration details from other sources. So in this particular case, I'm going to look directly into the logrotate.d directory for additional logrotate configuration. So if I go into that directory, take a look, you'll see that I have a number of files here that kind of look like services like NTP, rsync, Samba, Snapper. Now, these are not the actual daemons for what we're talking about, but instead they're simply names that refer to the daemons. So case in point, if I go into NTP, what this is defining is for the NTP service, where do I go to locate its log file, and how do I want to manage the log rotate? Okay, because in Etsy logrotate.conf, that is the general configuration system-wide. This is enabling me the capability to override some of those general settings. So case in point, in this file, or in this log rotate, we are going to compress. We're still taking advantage of date extension. Max age 365. So what that's basically saying is the maximum age of my log files are going to be 365 days. Now I got a little bit of a dichotomy here because I've got to rotate 99. So if I'm rotating every week, the last time I checked, 365 days, that's a year. The last time I checked, a year only has 52 weeks. So this is actually going to take precedence. I got another dichotomy because I've got a directive size equals plus 2048K. So in other words, what I'm saying is I will not rotate out my log file unless it's at least 2 meg in size. Okay, that's pretty cool. And then right below that, I have not if empty. So if I'm saying you have to be at least 2 meg, so I could be 1.5 meg, this still won't rotate it out, okay? And it's certainly not empty. So this would actually take precedence over not if empty. The other thing that you could do is with log rotate, you can actually perform some pre and post rotation activities. So in this particular case, post rotate, what I'm going to do is when I create the new log file, I'm going to go ahead and set the permissions chmod 644 for the new log file. Okay. All right, so that is log rotate. Okay, let's just go through real quick. The book also mentioned a command called support config. In a nutshell, what support config is it's a utility primarily going to be used by SUSE/Novell Technical Support Services. The purpose of support config is when you go to initiate an SR, a service request, you're contacting technical support for help. Instead of wasting your time and theirs trying to go through and gather a bunch of information so that they can ascertain what could be the source of your problem, they're going to have you run support config, and it's going to gather up all the pertinent log information, all the pertinent configuration information, things such as hardware configs, information about the hardware in general and such, and it's going to bundle all of that together into a tarball and then send that directly to technical support services. And then what they'll do is when you initiate the SR, they'll ask you to run support config, and then they'll basically tell you, hey, after we've had a chance to analyze your support config, we will get back to you with some corrective actions. So what it does is it completely takes out that step where they're like, hey, can you tell me what what the configuration is for NTP, or can you tell me what's being written into the log file? They don't need to do that because they've already captured that data through support config. Okay. And then section 12, I think it is, basically just talked about, or I'm sorry, section 10. Section 10 simply talked about hardware management. Now, I mentioned in an earlier call that the plug-and-play manager for SUSE is something called UDEV. It's very similar to kudzu in the Red Hat world. What UDEV does is it's constantly monitoring for any changes on the system, like plugging in a thumb drive into your USB port, detecting the change, detecting what was the piece of hardware involved in the change, attempting to find the appropriate module, aka driver, and then get it up and running. You can run commands like if you want to get information on your hardware, you can execute a command called hwinfo. I would highly recommend that you send that out to a text file because what it's going to do is it's going to literally probe the system for about, 30, 45 seconds. And if you don't redirect that info out to a text file or pipe it out to less, it's just going to blow through the screen. But what this is kind of like going into system details on a Windows box where you want to find out all of the pertinent data relative to your hardware. So if I take a look at this guy now, this is what the details of that data looks like. Okay. We talked about modules or drivers. The current method for managing your drivers is a command called modprobe. Now with modprobe, you can load a driver simply by typing in modprobe, followed by the driver itself. You can unload a driver by typing in modprobe-r, followed by whatever the driver name happens to be. So in this particular case, I don't know that the joystick driver is currently loaded or not, but if I wanted to, certainly I can remove it by executing modprobe-r space joydev. That gets rid of the actual driver. Okay, I can reload it by simply typing in modprobe space joydev. So everything except the -R, and that will load it back up. Okay. Now, modprobe actually replaces a series of commands, insert mod. That used to be the method in which we would load a module. rmmod was the command we used to use to remove a module. One of the issues with insert mod is if there were dependency modules, insert mod did not automatically load those dependencies. Okay, so that's why we went with modprobe. Okay, so that was basically all that was left with 3124. So I'm immediately going to switch gears, and we're going to talk about 3125 now. So 3125 actually started off by looking at pluggable authentication modules. Now, up to this point, we've been talking about the standard POSIX database. That was the Etsy Password, Etsy Shadow, and Etsy Group for our localized authentication processes. But what if we wanted to take advantage of other providers like LDAP or Active Directory or stuff like that? Well, that's where PAM comes in. PAM actually gives us the capability of looking at what kind of applications require authentication, such as login to login, SSH for secure shell, FTP for file transfer protocol, etc. And then connects that up with these other authentication methods. As I had mentioned before, we can still continue to use the standard POSIX database, but now we can also take advantage of things like LDAP, Active Directory, Novell's Open Enterprise Server, which uses eDirectory. Okay. Just really quickly, Karsten. So both insert mod and modprobe are used for loading kernel modules. What's the difference? Karsten, I believe I mentioned the difference. I don't know if you caught that. Insert mod is a legacy command. The problem with it is if there were dependency modules, insert mod did not load the dependencies, where modprobe does. Okay. All right. So now getting back to PAM. For PAM management, there is a directory, etsypam.d, and inside here, this is going to list all the various PAM files that are supplied by default. You can create your own PAM configuration if you so choose. Now, the PAM configuration file is made up of up to 4 fields of data per line. So let's take something like, let's look at login. That's easy enough, right? So even though this is kind of blowing through the screen here, the four field types we have are module type. That's what we have on the far left. That can include auth for authentication request, account to control access to things like, when you can log in. Session provides things such as what kinds of services that you may want to have access to, or things that are going to be occurring during the session. And then password, which would basically be doing things like dictionary checks to make sure that your password is not using just regular words, or verifying that you're maintaining password complexity. Okay. The control flag, which is going to consist of things such as required and requisite, optional and sufficient. With required and requisite, they basically do the same thing. Okay. In other words, before I'm going to allow you to authenticate, you've got to meet all of the criteria. You have to successfully pass all of the PAM modules associated with whatever you're looking to do. The difference between required and requisite: with required, even if you hit a failed state, it will continue processing all remaining PAM modules before rejecting you. Okay? With requisite, just as soon as I hit that first failed state, boom, I'm kicking you out. So some folks will sit back and say, well, then why would anyone use required? Why am I going to go through the hoops of continuing to process all remaining PAM modules? Well, maybe for logging purposes. Maybe I want to make sure that I'm tracking everything in which this user is failing before I outright reject them. So you're kind of playing mind games with the user. With optional, there are a series of optional things that you have, such as maybe you want to display a message to the user as part of the process. Okay, so it has no direct correlation on success or failure, but maybe I want to pass a message to the user saying, yes, you are logged in on TTY blah, or hey, you're not going to be able to log in on Friday for whatever reason. All right, sufficient is also another one that after module with this flag has been processed, I can either pass an application to receiving an immediate message for that success or failure. You can also have include statements. Now, we just got through talking about include statements with log rotate. And again, what include does is simply allow you to bring in configuration details from other sources outside the current config file that you're working from. The third field is going to identify the actual PAM module that you're looking to bring in. Okay. Now, PAM modules are always going to be located in the lib64/security directory. They will always begin, or usually begin, with PAM underscore followed by the module itself and then a .so extension. Okay. The fourth field, you may or may not see this. Within the fourth field, you are going to have things such as additional arguments, like you can use debug to provide some additional debugging information for log files. You can suppress warning messages with no warn, things of that nature. Okay, so let's take a look, or not take a look, but let's talk about some of the more common PAM modules, which, by the way, were listed on page 18 in the 3125 manual, such as the PAM no login. Let's see. So if I look in here, you can see within the login PAM module, PAM configuration, you've got this no login. All right. Now, with no login, what happens is if by chance you create in the etc directory a file called no login, doesn't have to have any content whatsoever. It's just a file. You could use touch for that matter. If that file exists, so /etc/no login, it will prohibit anybody from logging into the system. It's kind of like a disable login function. Now, some folks will probably sit back and say, why in the world would you ever want to do that? Well, maybe I need to perform some maintenance items like updating certain services. So then that usually follows up with, well, then why didn't you just boot into single user mode? Well, maybe I need the full functionality of the box in order for a particular service to be running, in order for it to be properly updated. Or maybe I want to test the operation of a particular service, but I don't want anyone else logging into the box while I'm doing that. So again, if no login or the PAM underscore no login is invoked, all I have to do is create a file in etc called no login, and it disables anybody else from logging in. It does not affect current login sessions, but it will prohibit anybody new from logging in. Another PAM module called SecureTTY, what that does is that will look into the etc directory for a file called SecureTTY. Inside this file, I'm going to declare all virtual TTYs that users can log into. So in a very lame security model, if users had physical access to the server, that's problem number one, they would have to know which TTY they could log into if I edited this file. So let's say I deleted everything but TTY5. So pretend with me for a minute, TTY5 was the only item in this file. The user would have to know that they would have to be on TTY5 before they could log in, even if they were providing successful login credentials. Okay? And the book went through several other examples. I'm not going to spend the time looking at those, just to so that we can keep moving on here. We talked about the fact that PAM can be used to verify passwords. That is done through the PAM_cracklib library. Okay, what that does is it checks for dictionary words, common words. If you invoke password complexity, it will go through and verify all of that to make sure that passwords are meeting a certain standard. Okay, I think I mentioned this before, but just in case I did not, anytime you install a service on the box, it will place any kind of documentation that is available for that service in a directory called user share doc packages. So if I take a look in that directory, you'll see that I've got a whole bunch of directories here associated with services or applications that have been installed on this box. So in the case of PAM, if I go into user share doc packages PAM, you'll see that I've got my documentation for PAM. This is a resource for you to take advantage of. You've got text files, so I've got the SAG for the System Administrator Guide, MWG for the Module Writer's Guide to write your own modules, ADG for Application Developer's Guide. If I go deeper into HTML, all of that documentation is in an HTML format, so I can bring that up into a web browser and have a much prettier format. Okay, and of course we can also get help with PAM by invoking man pages. Okay, all right, so that's all I wanted to talk about as far as PAM. Another module that's gaining a lot of traction is the System Security Services daemon. That is these two authentication services that you see here. If I go into Authentication Client, inside here, I can actually go through and configure services such as, well, actually, let me just add one in here. So let's say I wanted to go in and configure an authentication daemon for LDAP. What kind of provider do I want to use? Use the default provider. Yeah. Oh, I forgot to give it a name. Okay. And inside here, it just gives me a modular format by which I can start configuring authentication domains. Okay. Now, in this course, all we did is we wanted to point your attention to the fact that these guys exist. I think I don't even think there was a lab module associated with this, but it's important for you to know that this exists because this is going to be growing in its use relative to SLES 12. As a matter of fact, there is a brand new course dedicated to working with SSSD. Okay, so do keep that in mind. All right, what am I looking at for time? Okay, 10 minutes. All right. Let me get through this last little tidbit, and I guess we'll call it a day from there. All right, so we talked before about the file system security model. Let me just clear this out. All right, so for file system security, we've got our standard POSIX method by which we can implement security. Okay, Basically, you've got a user owner of a file or a directory, a group owner for the file or directory, and then based upon that, we've got our rights. So the first three sets of rights apply to the user owner. The next three sets of rights apply to the group owner, and then everything else falls under other, which applies to any other user on the system, okay? If you're coming from other operating systems like Windows or even Novell's security, this seems really lame because of the fact that I can only have one user owner, I can only have one group owner, and effectively other is kind of like everyone, okay? That doesn't leave you with a lot of flexibility here, okay? So we have something called ACLs, Access Control List, and the term ACL is used with everybody else, like Microsoft, Novell, etc. Now, what ACLs do is they allow us to extend beyond just user, owner, group owner, and other by allowing us to incorporate other what we call named users and named groups. So this, Jane, is referred to as the owner. The video is referred to in this context as the group owner. So let's say for a moment I wanted to add some additional trustees, or if you want to call them that, owners or people who have access to file. Let me just find who I have as far as a user available to me. Joe. Okay, so I got Joe to work with. All right, so let's say for a moment I want to, in addition to Jane and video, I want Joe to have access to this file. So what I have a couple commands. Set FACL, which allows me to manipulate security. And I've got get FACL, which simply allows me to view that information. Okay, so let's talk about set FACL first. With set FACL, I've got a series of switches. -M allows me to either add a new file access control list or modify an existing one. So with set FACL -M for file, let's say I want to add a user to this to have access to this file. It would be set FACL -M U for user, colon. I would identify the user, Cred Muffins. I just completely lost track of who the user was. Oh, Joe. Okay. So I'm going to basically type in set FACL -M U for user, Joe is the user, and what permissions I want to grant Joe for file. Now, if I perform my ls-l, I have no idea that Joe has rights to this file. The only indicator or flag that I have that something else is going on under the covers is this plus sign. That is my only indicator that, hey, I might have an access control list, okay? Now, in order to retrieve that information, I've got to execute get FACL. Now, when I run get FACL, you could see this user here is referring to the user owner. In other words, in this case, Jane. The group is referring to the group owner, which in this case is video. But now you can see that I've got a named user, Joe. All right, let's say I want to add a group to this. So I could say set FACL -M to modify, G for group. Let's go with audio. We're just going to give audio read to file. And now you can see audio is showing up as a named group. And I can keep going and going, adding individual users and groups, similar to what you got with other operating systems. Now, there are a couple issues with this. First of all, the way that I'm able to do this is by kind of sort of leveraging the group permission. Okay, so I want you to take note. Here's video. Video has read, write, and execute. Joe has read and write. Okay, now if I run a command, common command like chmod g equals r for file, you could see that now video only has read permission. If I run my getFackle, notice that Joe still technically was given or granted read and write, but because the group permission is set to read, notice that Joe's effective permission is read. Okay, so this is where I was talking about before. We're kind of sort of borrowing the capability of the group owner's permission in order to extend this out to access control lists. Now, if I turn around and I reestablish those permissions for the group, then everything is all back with the world again. Okay? Let's see. Oliver, why is group r-x in getFackle and in the ls-l it's rwx? That's a good question. Let me do that again, just for grins and giggles. Oops. All right, so we got RWX now. If I do my chmod, G equals R for file, and then I do my getFackle. All right, let me try one last thing here. Who was that posted that? That was Oliver, right? Just a thought here. Let me do chmod O equals R for file. That might be a little bit of a bug. I'll have to look into that one, Oliver, because you're absolutely correct. There should not be an execute attribute here. Originally, I was thinking maybe it was getting it by virtue of other, but that's not the case. Do note, though, his effective write is simply read. So I think functionally it still gets us to where we need to be, but yeah, that's I've never had that brought to my attention before. Good call, or good catch. Okay. Yeah, it's not representing the group, the named group at all, or the group owner at all. I'm gonna have to look into that. Now you got me curious on that one. Let's see, Karsten, did you mask rights instead of assigning rights? No, Karsten, chmod is establishing rights. That's not masking. Let's see, Stephen, it may be because the directory's group permissions are set. Now that's possible, but that still should not impact. When I do a getFackle, it should be a representation of the entity specifically that I'm calling for. Okay, so again, I'll take a look at it. That's a very interesting catch. All right, some other things that I can do with getFackle, or I'm sorry, setFackle. Let's say I wanted to remove a particular entry. I can execute setfackle-x G colon audio, oops, for file. And what that does is it deletes the single entry within the ACL. If you want to remove all ACL entries, hang on, hit the wrong button on my Mac. There we go. So if I want to remove all ACL entries, it's setfackle-x for the destination, and that totally blows, or I'm sorry, not X, B. That removes all of the ACL entries for that particular entity or target. Okay. Now, if you are going to be implementing ACLs, it would probably be a good idea at a parent directory to establish a default ACL. That way, anytime you put any additional files or directories within the directory, the default ACL applies to those items as well. And the way that you would do that is with a -D for default. Okay. I mentioned before that we've already seen that there's some little minor issues with setfackle or ACLs in general. Namely, I don't get to see the ACL from doing an ls-l. The only thing I get is the plus sign. We're also borrowing from the group owner's permissions. We saw how that can be affected with Chmod. Another probably greater issue to be concerned about is not all applications understand ACLs. So if you have named users and named groups and your application doesn't understand an ACL, they would not be recognized by the application. And you know what makes it even worse is there's backup software that does not understand ACLs. So your backup software can certainly back up the data, but it would not retain the ACL information. So in the book, they actually talk about, to cover your bases, one recommended application that you might want to consider for backup, if you don't have third-party applications, is something called Star Archiver, because Star Archiver will preserve ACL data. Okay. The other thing that I would recommend personally is if you are going to be implementing ACLs. I mean, right now you're seeing me just do this at the console. That's fine. Okay. But what I would highly encourage you to do is create and maintain an ongoing script file. So let's say within roots, in my case, roots directory, I'm going to touch a file called ACL entries.sh. Okay. Now we're going to get into scripting later in this course, but just to kind of give you an idea, let's say I'm going to do a shebang. You have to identify what shell interpreter you're going to use. And then let's say hypothetically, I'm creating, remember that HR directory? Let's say I want to create some ACLs for that. So I can actually do a setfackle -m u colon Bob, even though Bob doesn't exist right now, but let's say Bob did. So just so you get an idea, setfackle, there we go. All right, so anytime I want to create an ACL, certainly I can do it at the command line, but the other thing that I could do is if I simply incorporate it into a script file, and then when I'm done, run the script, then all I have to do is make sure I keep a copy of this file, And even if my backup software doesn't understand ACLs, as long as I can restore this script, I run it, my ACLs will all be reestablished. So it's kind of like a CYA operation, but also a documentation type of thing. Let's see. Theory. Does TAR keep track of ACLs? I'll have to double check that for you, Theory. I don't believe it does, but I'm sure I can be mistaken. Let's see. Hugo. Are ACLs a SUSE-specific implementation? No. They are available on other Linux distributions as well. And as far as your secondary question, why don't other applications and software support it? I can't answer you on that. I can make up something, but they just didn't incorporate that into the code for whatever reason. Okay. Mohammed, are the ACLs saved in any file? I believe they're actually cached, Mohammed. And that's why I would recommend, well, I take that back. Wait a minute. Do me a favor, Mohammed. Could you post that in the Academy portal? They have to be saved somewhere because if you reboot the box, the ACLs will still be there. But yeah, if you could post that question in the Academy, that's a good question, and I'd like to respond back to you. Okay. All right. We're already 7 minutes past the hour, folks. So I think at this point we're going to call it a day. What I'll do is next week we will pick up really quickly with AppArmor and some of the other stuff that we couldn't get to today. And then also work our way into the week 7 stuff. Okay. Any other last minute burning questions on what we discussed today before we call it? Let's see. Does Etsy no login also affect the root account? No, Thomas. You're talking about the PAM module when you invoke no login. Yeah, root's the omnipotent being. So, nothing affects root. Okay. Alan, must we build a new VM? I'm assuming you're talking about for the 3125 course, Alan. And if you recall last week, I'm pretty sure I mentioned that you needed to make sure that you had downloaded the virtual machines for 3125 because they were unique to that course. Now, the server 3 in that is basically a blank machine, similar to server 1 in 3124. Because I believe we actually use that for Pixie so that we can demonstrate how you can create Pixie services. Okay? Any other question, folks? Antonio, does the ACL remain after a reboot? Yes, that's why I had asked Mohammed to post a question as a reminder for me to locate where that data is stored. Karsten, are you going to be talking about AppArmor, RootCA? Yes, Karsten. Again, I mentioned that I would pick up quickly on AppArmor next week and everything else. Let's see. Jonathan, what is the PAM module for managing passwords? If you're talking about checking passwords, that was that cracklib. Okay. All right, folks, I guess we will go ahead. Yes, cracklib. That's exactly it. Pam_cracklib to be specific. That's from Jonathan. And just for the record, I'm going to quickly find that. Look on page 21 in the 3125 page 21 in the 3125 manual. Yep. All right. All right. So with that, folks, I think we're going to call it a day. Hope you guys have a great weekend, and we'll look forward to chatting with you guys next week. Take care.